In the quiet shelters beneath the ruined world, every vault carried a secret purpose, experiments that shaped the people trapped inside. Tonight, we'll drift through those stories, listening to how each experiment changed not just the vaults themselves, but the wasteland that followed. Vault 3 was never meant to be legendary. It wasn't a dramatic psychological maze, a cruel biological trial, or one of the infamous nightmare vaults that twisted morality beyond recognition. On paper, Vault 3 belonged to the quiet category, a control vault, a place where things were supposed to work as advertised. Clean air, steady food, filtered water, and orderly life beneath the desert floor near what would one day become the neon glow of New Vegas. Its inhabitants were told they would be safe, insulated from chaos, sheltered through the storm until the world above became something survivable again. For a long time, they believed that promise, and for a long stretch of years, that belief shaped everything inside its steel corridors. Life in Vault 3 became defined by patience. Generations grew up never seeing sunlight. They studied lessons written before the bombs. They maintained hydroponic gardens, repaired aging machinery, and held on to the assumption that one day, eventually, a signal would arrive telling them that the time to rejoin the world had finally come. Unlike many other vaults, they weren't manipulated by an overseer with secret, morally impossible instructions. Their overseer managed rations, disputes, maintenance schedules, and population ethics with a straightforward purpose: keep everyone alive and sane until further notice. And in that structure, a quiet pride developed. The residents of Vault 3 weren't rebels or martyrs. They were caretakers of continuity. They believed they were the proof that the vault system had worked. Over time, the vault culture settled into something that almost resembled suburban life sealed in steel. Families formed rhythms. Children grew up knowing the corridors the way someone might know streets in an old neighborhood. There was monotony, yes, but also comfort in routine. The hum of generators became a lullaby. The hiss of recycled air was background music. When disputes arose, they were handled with meetings, conversations, committees. Vault 3 didn't depend on fear or coercion to stay orderly. It depended on the shared understanding that everything inside the vault, every pipe, every battery, every line of code, was fragile, and if they wanted to survive, they had to treat each other with care. That sense of stability makes what happened later feel particularly tragic, because Vault 3 didn't collapse due to violence from within or experiments gone wrong. It began to fall apart because of something mundane and terrifyingly human: infrastructure failure. Deep inside the filtration systems that kept them alive, a problem slowly grew: corrosion, creeping into water lines that had never been designed to last forever. At first, the issue felt manageable. Maintenance teams patched leaks, rerouted flow, and reassured the population that everything was fine. But over years, the damage compounded. The vault's isolation had protected its residents from the horrors of the outside world, yet it also meant they had no access to new parts and no outside assistance. Eventually, the truth became unavoidable. The water purification system would fail completely unless something changed. That realization forced a conversation the vault had spent generations avoiding. They would have to open the door, not permanently, not recklessly, but enough to trade, to contact outsiders, to find supplies that could save them. For a community that had prided itself on patience and caution, this was existentially frightening. The wasteland had become mythical in their collective imagination, a radioactively scorched wilderness populated by desperate survivors and unknown dangers. But thirst is persuasive. Real survival pressure breaks even the most carefully preserved philosophies. After meetings, debates, and reluctant planning, Vault 3 chose to do something that felt bold, even radical for them. They opened limited trade with surface dwellers. At first, it seemed almost hopeful. Caravans approached cautiously, surprised to find a functioning vault with organized residents and reasonable negotiators. Vault 3 traded medical services, clean water surplus, and occasional technical assistance in exchange for replacement parts, tools, and information. The people of Vault 3 discovered something unexpected. The wasteland wasn't simply chaos. It was complicated, yes, dangerous, fractured, unpredictable, but it was also filled with humans trying to survive. Slowly, trust crept in. Outsiders were allowed to enter small portions of the vault for negotiations. Some residents even began to believe that perhaps they had waited long enough, that maybe, gradually, their isolation could soften into coexistence. Unfortunately, the wasteland doesn't judge by intentions. Word spreads quickly in broken worlds, and when a place with resources becomes known, it becomes a target. Vault 3's openness eventually drew the attention of people far different from the traders they had begun to know. The Fiends, violent chem-driven raiders, fueled by addiction and cruelty, heard about this quiet vault with its clean rooms and soft-spoken negotiators. To the Fiends, it wasn't a community. It was an opportunity, a place stocked with medicine, supplies, and sheltered space ready to conquer. What followed wasn't strategy. It was exploitation masked as diplomacy. A group of fiends approached the vault, posing as ordinary travelers seeking trade or assistance. Because Vault 3 had begun to trust, the guards allowed them in. The moment when hospitality turned into invasion still hangs like a shadow over the vault's story. Once inside, the fiends struck, using brutality and shock to overwhelm defenders who had never truly prepared for this kind of violence. Life in Vault 3 had conditioned people to think in terms of cooperation and maintenance, not ambushes and bloodshed. The attack became swift and merciless. The fiends slaughtered their way through families, clinics, and communal spaces, tearing apart a society that had survived war, isolation, and technical hardship, only to die at the hands of people who saw nothing sacred in survival except the power it gave them. For the few who resisted, the effort was desperate but futile. Their weapons were outdated, their training limited, their entire worldview unprepared for the idea that strangers would exploit kindness so completely. Within a short span, Vault 3, once one of the more functional vaults in the region, became another casualty of the wasteland's cruel calculus. The fiends seized it as a base, contaminating its halls with chem labs, weapon caches, and the constant chaos of addiction-driven paranoia. Rooms designed for meetings and schooling turned into dens of violence. The hum of generators still echoed, but the warmth and normalcy that once existed there evaporated entirely. And yet, even inside tragedy, the image of Vault 3 lingers as something profoundly human. Unlike vaults twisted from the beginning by deliberate cruelty, Vault 3 represents the fragility of good intentions. These were people who tried to do everything right. They followed protocol. They waited. They debated. They opened their doors cautiously, not out of greed, but necessity. In another world, a kinder version of the wasteland, that decision might have led to their integration into a broader community, to slow rebuilding, to a story where patience finally paid off. Instead, their fate became a cautionary tale whispered by travelers. Even functional systems can collapse when the world outside has not healed enough to meet them halfway. The fiends, for their part, never cared about the vault's symbolism. To them, it was simply shelter defensible, stocked, and easily fortified. They painted graffiti, dragged stolen belongings through the halls, and cemented their presence with violence. But the vault itself held memories in every corridor, silent reminders that before the raiders came, children once learned multiplication in those classrooms, couples argued gently in those living quarters, and committee meetings once discussed crop yields rather than invasion threats. Walking through Vault 3 inches its later state, you can almost feel the echo of what was lost, as if the building itself resents the transformation, yet concedes it has no choice. In a way, the story of Vault 3 mirrors a recurring theme throughout Fallout. Survival is not simply about preparation, it is also about timing, luck, and the intentions of those around you. Vault 3 was proof that humans could survive underground patiently and sanely for more than a century. It proved the vault system didn't always require dramatic moral horror to remain stable, but it also proved that when isolation finally breaks, the outside world can be as deadly as any experiment. The vault became vulnerable the moment it needed help, and in the wasteland, vulnerability often invites exploitation instead of compassion. Some might wonder whether there was anything the residents could have done differently. Could tighter security have saved them? Could stricter policies about outsider access have prevented disaster? Those questions remain unanswered, partly because Vault 3's downfall was built on inevitabilities layered over time. Machines fail, populations age, resources run thin. No vault could remain sealed forever without adaptation, and adaptation always meant facing risk. Vault 3 took that risk in good faith and paid the ultimate price, not because of their mistakes, but because they encountered one of the wasteland's harshest truths. Goodness alone cannot guarantee safety. What remains of their story is less about the fiends and more about the quiet dignity of the people who lived there before them. For generations, they held together a functioning society under impossible conditions, proving that not every vault was doomed by design. They raised children who knew cooperation instead of cruelty. They built routines, traditions, and lives within steel walls, believing that one day all of it would matter beyond those doors. Even though their ending was bleak, the years they sustained, stability still echo throughout the region, a testament to how resilient ordinary people can be when given structure and purpose. Standing in the dust-filled corridors of Vault 3, long after the takeover, you can imagine what it might have looked like before everything changed. Clean floors, organized storage, the distant murmur of conversation. The vault wasn't a laboratory of suffering or a twisted social puzzle. It was simply a community hoping to endure, and in that calm picture lies the real weight of its fall. The wasteland didn't need to corrupt Vault 3 from within. It only had to wait. In the end, Vault 3's experiment, if you can call it that, becomes something larger than the usual narrative of manipulation. It demonstrates that survival strategies built on isolation inevitably collide with external chaos. It shows that even perfect planning will eventually require trust, and trust in a broken world is always dangerous. And it leaves behind a haunting paradox. But because the world outside had never recovered enough to meet stability with respect instead of predation. As you drift off thinking about the fate of Vault 3, the image that remains isn't the brutality of its final hours, but the long stretch of quiet years before them. Families gathered around dim lights, engineers smoothing out glitches, children learning history written by people who believed, sincerely, that patience would save them. In a universe full of engineered cruelty, Vault 3 reminds us that sometimes the saddest stories aren't the ones twisted by experiment, but the ones undone by the fragile hope that people beyond the door might be ready for peace when it finally opens. Vault 4 was different from the moment it was conceived. Where most vaults hid their true purposes behind layers of secrecy and carefully crafted lies, Vault 4 was openly presented to its residents and to the broader world before the bombs as something respectable, even noble. It was marketed as a vault for scientists, a refuge where the brightest minds would continue their research safely while civilization above them burned and rebuilt. To the public, it sounded reassuring. If you couldn't save everyone, then at least preserve the people who understood medicine, biology, engineering, and genetics. Inside the polished brochures and quiet government briefings, Vault 4 represented continuity through intellect. Knowledge would survive because those entrusted with it would live. But inside Vault 4, that clarity masks something more complicated. A vault filled exclusively with scientists might sound like utopia to anyone who believes knowledge solves everything. Yet the absence of other professions, teachers, farmers, artists, laborers, leaders, created an environment defined entirely by study, experimentation, and quiet ambition. Every resident had training. Every resident had objectives. Conversations didn't revolve around family dinners or entertainment schedules. They revolved around research proposals, test parameters, and theories about how humanity might adapt to a radically altered future. Over time, Vault 4 became less a shelter and more a laboratory sealed beneath the earth, humming with meticulous curiosity. Early life inside the vault was controlled, methodical, and almost eerily calm. The residents organized themselves with little resistance. Committees formed, research labs were prioritized. Advanced equipment, preserved before the war, was unpacked, calibrated, and powered up with almost ceremonial reverence. The overseer functioned more as an administrator than an authority figure, coordinating timelines and resource allocation rather than enforcing behavior. There were no dramatic authoritarian speeches, no ominous secret orders to follow. Instead, there was a simple shared understanding. Vault 4 existed to study survival, and study, by its nature, requires subjects. At first, the scientists focused on themselves. They monitored physical responses to underground living, gathered data on long-term isolation, and tracked genetic markers across families. But self-observation has limits, and boredom, even among intellectuals, creeps in quietly. The archive of pre-war knowledge contained thousands of unfinished projects, hypotheses left hanging by the bombs, and urgent questions without answers. Outside the vault, radiation and environmental collapse would soon rewrite biology in chaotic ways. Inside, the researchers saw not tragedy but opportunity, a rare, controlled environment where human evolution itself might be guided, cataloged, and in their most ambitious fantasies, improved. In that shift from survival to experimentation lies the heart of Vault 4's transformation. A community that began with good intentions gradually slid into morally gray territory, not through malice, but through rationalization. If the world was broken, they reasoned, then future humanity would require adaptation to survive it. And who better to shape that adaptation than disciplined scientists, protected underground, free from political constraints and desperate governments? In their minds, they were guardians of the future, not tyrants. They began to discuss selective breeding, genetic screening, and controlled exposure to environmental stressors, not because they wanted power over people, but because they believed knowledge gave them responsibility. The problem was that Vault 4 lacked diversity not just in profession, but in perspective. Without ordinary citizens there to resist or question ethical boundaries, every debate became academic. Subjects turned into data points, hypotheticals turned into proposals, and eventually, proposals turned into policy. The vault adopted an official stance. Opening the doors to select survivors from the outside was not a humanitarian act, it was research. The scientists announced that those who arrived seeking refuge could enter, but they would enter as volunteers in genetic experimentation. The logic sounded almost benevolent when spoken aloud. These survivors would receive food, shelter, medical care, and protection, all in exchange for participation in studies that promised to help rebuild society better than before. Outside, they would likely die. Inside, they would live, albeit under observation. Many refugees who stumbled toward Vault 4 had lost families, suffered radiation exposure, and were desperate for stability. Presented with a choice between torment above ground or controlled oversight below, some agreed willingly. Others hesitated, only to be convinced by the certainty and confidence of the scientists explaining that all of this was for the greater good. Over time, Vault 4 filled not just with brilliant researchers, but with frightened survivors reclassified as test material. The experiments escalated slowly, the way such things always do. First came harmless studies, blood tests, sleep monitoring, muscle efficiency trials, assessments of nutritional intake under controlled diets. But the conclusions drawn from those initial projects inevitably led to questions about resilience, mutation tolerance, and the human body's breaking points. To model adaptation, the scientists needed variation. To observe variation, they needed risk. Gradually, moral lines warped, exposure tests began. Genetic manipulation trials were proposed, then approved. Radiation levels were adjusted. Some subjects adapted or seemed to, others suffered or died, in sterile labs deep underground, clipboards filled with data even as the vault's original promise eroded into something unrecognizable. What makes Vault 4 particularly haunting is not just what the scientists did, but how they justified it. They recorded failures not as tragedies, but as valuable information. Subjects were mourned in brief memos before their remains became samples. Those who survived were praised as breakthroughs. And throughout everything, the researchers convinced themselves that history would eventually vindicate them. The world outside had been destroyed by leaders who acted without scientific grounding. Vault 4, they believed, would avoid repeating that mistake by allowing science to reign without interference. But science without conscience becomes something else entirely. The breaking point came not through a single catastrophic event, but through accumulation whispers among subjects growing into quiet defiance, resentment boiling beneath the surface of polite clinical conversations. Refugees who had arrived grateful for safety slowly realized they had traded one form of brutality for another. They had shelter, yes, but no autonomy. Their lives were scheduled, measured, and manipulated. Their children were observed not as individuals, but as generational studies. Trust decayed, and in its place grew anger sharpened by confinement. Eventually, as happens in many vaults, anger found direction. The subjects organized themselves, sharing information and plotting in corridors the scientists rarely entered. They recognized a truth the researchers had somehow overlooked. No matter how controlled the environment, there are always variables you cannot predict, and human desperation is among the most volatile. When the revolt finally happened, it wasn't the chaotic outburst of frightened people. It was deliberate, coordinated, doors jammed open, security systems sabotaged. Laboratories stormed by those who had spent years being spoken about instead of spoken to. Violence erupted not because they were savages, but because they had been treated as experiments rather than fellow survivors. The scientists, brilliant though they were, discovered the limits of theoretical planning when confronted with fury. Backup protocols failed, chain of command collapsed, Panic replaced authority. Those who tried to reason with the subjects found their carefully structured ethics drowned out by years of suppressed humiliation and pain. In the end, many of the researchers were killed not for curiosity itself, but for the arrogance that had allowed them to decide that survival granted them permission to reshape other lives without consent. And then, something remarkable happened. Unlike many Vault uprisings that lead to total collapse, the survivors of Vault 4 did not destroy the facility. They repurposed it. Once the scientists were gone and the experimentation stopped, the people who had been test subjects refused to perpetuate the same structures of control. They dismantled the most oppressive parts of the system, kept the technology necessary for stability, and opened the vault to outsiders, not as a trap, but as a refuge. Word spread across the wasteland of a vault that accepted people without judgment or experimentation, providing real sanctuary instead of conditions disguised as kindness. In that transformation, Vault 4 became something unexpected, a place where the victims of one philosophy built a different one from its ashes. They learned, painfully, that survival without humanity is hollow. Instead of conducting more studies, they focused on living. Instead of optimizing genetic potential, they prioritized cooperation. Outsiders entering Vault 4 encountered not scientists in white coats, but communities trying to heal, patching old rooms with new purpose, and turning former laboratories into living spaces, schools, infirmaries, and communal halls. Where data once ruled, compassion slowly took root. Walking through Vault 4 after its revolt, you can still sense the tension between what it was and what it became. There are sealed doors that hide scars. Abandoned equipment stands like monuments to ambition gone wrong. Genetic charts hang yellowing on walls beside childish drawings from new families that found shelter there later. The air carries the faint echo of arguments long resolved and traumas still quietly processed. And underneath it all lies a story repeated across Fallout's world. Brilliance without empathy can be just as dangerous as brute force. What makes Vault 4 stand apart in the long chain of Vault experiments is that its lesson wasn't theoretical. It was lived. People learned firsthand that being studied strips dignity, that decisions made for the greater good can become excuses for cruelty, and that knowledge used without consent fractures communities instead of strengthening them. In time, the Vault's new inhabitants came to view the pre-war scientists almost as tragic figures, not pure villains, but people who allowed fear and ambition to outrun their moral anchors. They had wanted to save humanity, yet forgot to remain human themselves. And somewhere deep inside the vault, among the quiet corridors now used for ordinary conversations, exists an unspoken vow carried forward by those who remained. Never again will survival be purchased at the cost of someone else's autonomy. They understand more clearly than most how easily necessity can be twisted into justification. They live with the memory of what it feels like to be told that your suffering is simply a data point. And because of that, they guard the Vault's new identity carefully, refusing to let it slide backward into the cold comfort of scientific certainty. In the end, Vault 4 stands as one of Fallout's most nuanced vaults. Not purely evil, not purely noble, but deeply human in its failures and its eventual redemption. It started with high ideals, descended into ethical blindness, collapsed under the weight of resistance, and finally rose again as a shelter shaped by those who had every reason to hate it. It reminds us that intelligence alone cannot guide a broken world, that compassion, consent, and humility matter just as much as innovation. Vault 11 did not look any different from the others when its residents first entered, frightened and hopeful, clinging to the promise of survival sealed behind heavy steel. The structure was familiar: corridors, living quarters, hydroponics, classrooms, a central overseer's office overlooking everything like an impartial eye. What none of them knew, though, was that Vault 11 was built upon a lie so cruelly elegant that it would test the very core of their humanity. Unlike the control vaults, Vault 11 wasn't meant to preserve society. It was designed to watch it fracture under moral pressure. And from the moment the blast doors sealed, the countdown to tragedy had already begun. Shortly after the vault settled into routine, the residents learned of their mandate. They were told that the vault's mainframe had been programmed with a grim safeguard. At regular intervals, the community would be required to vote for one individual to be sacrificed. That person would be sent down to the sacrificial chamber, described as necessary to prevent catastrophe. If they refused to comply, if they ever chose not to send someone, the system threatened to punish them all. The implication was clear: one life chosen regularly in exchange for stability, one person gone so that many could continue. The message was framed as both unavoidable and moral. At first, the vault entered into shock. Sacrificing neighbors, people they had eaten meals with, shared laughter with, raised children beside, felt unnatural. But fear has a way of reshaping ethics. As rumors spread describing the devastation that could come from refusal, residents began to interpret the rule not as brutality, but as duty. They rationalized it as a grim but necessary survival mechanism. Elections were held, arguments erupted, whispered alliances formed. Votes became less about moral sacrifice and more about strategy, politics, and grudges quietly settled under the guise of collective protection. The voting booth turned friends into adversaries, and every disagreement into a potential death sentence. Over time, the ritual carved itself into culture. Posters reminded residents of their obligation. Campaigns quietly encouraged people to do the right thing. Some residents attempted to volunteer, believing martyrdom might ease the strain on the community. Others ran manipulative campaigns to protect themselves, building influence so that their names never appeared on the ballot. The overseer office, originally intended to lead administration, became a throne surrounded by fear. Whoever held the position exerted immense influence over the outcome of each vote, and corruption inevitably seeped into the process like water through cracked pipes. Years passed, and Vault 11 evolved into something grimly bureaucratic. Sacrifice became normalized, the way taxes or maintenance schedules become normalized elsewhere. Children grew up learning that sometimes people simply vanished because that was how the vault worked. The moral question of whether the system itself was wrong faded into the background. Residents debated which individuals deserved sacrifice, not whether sacrifice should happen at all. Violence followed politics. Elections were tainted by manipulation, threats, and whispers in the corridors. Humanity narrowed into calculation. Eventually, the system created factions groups dedicated to ensuring their members remained safe, while outsiders, or perceived undesirables, bore the burden instead. Those factions schemed tirelessly, weaponizing empathy when it was useful and discarding it when power demanded. The Vault, which should have unified people under common fate, instead fragmented them into isolated camps. Trust evaporated. Every conversation carried an undercurrent of suspicion. Even friendships became fragile negotiations beneath the shadow of the inevitable vote. There were moments of resistance. Some residents argued that they should test the system by refusing to vote at all, suspecting manipulation, but they were drowned out or silenced by fear-mongering voices insisting that rebellion would doom them all. For a long while, that fear triumphed. People clung to the belief that compliance equaled safety, even as the cost accumulated like ghosts lining the corridors. They told themselves that the sacrificed individuals died for the greater good, that the vault was still a community despite the cruelty embedded in its governance. The breaking point came when one election went too far. Political maneuvering escalated into coercion so brutal that the meaning of sacrifice collapsed entirely. Instead of nominating someone they believed could accept the role or who had volunteered, the factions rigged the vote to eliminate a rival purely for power. The death that followed wasn't cloaked in moral language anymore. It was nakedly self-serving. That realization shattered whatever illusions remained. For the first time, a critical number of residents saw the entire system not as moral necessity, but as an abomination they had willingly perpetuated. A movement formed, one not based on power, but on conscience. Its leaders argued that continuing the sacrifices made them complicit in cruelty that may not have ever been justified. They proposed the unthinkable. They would refuse to hold another vote. They would face whatever consequences came together without sacrificing anyone else. The idea was both liberating and terrifying. No one knew what the mainframe would do if the ritual stopped. Would the vault flood with poison gas, shut down life support, open the doors to certain death? The unknown loomed like a physical presence. But for the first time since entering the vault, fear did not win entirely. The community, shaken by guilt and disgust at their own history, decided to make a stand. They approached the terminal. They refused to submit a name. They waited, and then the truth revealed itself in the most quiet, devastating way possible. The mainframe responded not with punishment, but with congratulation. It informed them that they had passed the real test, that Vault 11 was designed to study whether a population, under pressure, would choose principle over self-preservation. The sacrifice requirement had been a lie, a fabricated threat intended to push them into complicity. The real success condition was moral courage, to refuse to take innocent life even when convinced it was necessary. The vault would never have harmed them if they had refused from the beginning. In that moment, the weight of every previous sacrifice crashed over the survivors like suffocating water. All the lives lost, all the factions formed, all the betrayals justified, every rationalization, every whispered excuse about greater good, all of it unnecessary. Worse than unnecessary orchestrated cruelty acted out willingly, reaffirmed year after year because people accepted a system instead of questioning it. The realization hollowed the vault. Guilt became unbearable. Arguments exploded into violence. Suicides followed. Some residents, unable to face what they had done, destroyed themselves rather than live with the knowledge that they had been both victims and perpetrators. By the time the dust settled, only a handful remained. Those few recorded messages for anyone who might one day find Vault 11. Their voices shaken, fragile, full of grief, warned future discoverers not just about the vault itself, but about the nature of obedience. They urged listeners to remember that authority must always be questioned, especially when it demands moral compromise. They reminded anyone who heard them that the easiest path is often the one paved with horrifying justification. And then, after leaving behind that cautionary echo, the survivors opened the vault door and walked out into the wasteland, carrying trauma they would never fully escape. Vault 11 stands out not because of monsters or environmental disasters, but because its horror emerged entirely from human psychology. It asked a community whether they would kill to save themselves, and that community, over and over, decided that yes, they would. The vault system never forced their hands directly. It only provided a suggestion and a threat. Everything else, The political corruption, the factional violence, the normalization of cruelty came from inside the population itself. What makes the story so haunting is the fragile line between what happened and what could have been. If, at the very beginning, they had refused, no one would have died. If even one brave majority had stood firm earlier, the suffering would have stopped. Instead, the culture of obedience calcified, and every death reinforced the illusion that the system must be necessary. Vault 11 becomes a monument to how easy it is for ordinary people to commit extraordinary harm when they believe there is no alternative. Walking through its silent corridors long after the tragedy, you can still feel the residue of those choices. Election posters hang crooked on walls. Terminals hold records of debates, votes, and justifications. The sacrificial chamber sits at the end of a lonely hallway, now just a room with machinery that never truly had any intention of harming anyone. The true damage was always psychological. The true weapon was fear, dressed up as logic. And yet, embedded somewhere inside this bleakness, there is a small, painful shard of hope. At the very end, when confronted with the truth, the survivors of Vault 11 chose differently. They stepped away from the cycle. They refused to spill more blood. Their decision came far too late to save those who had already died, but it proved that even within systems designed to corrode morality, people retain the ability, however fragile, to reclaim it. Vault 12 was built on a contradiction. It was advertised as salvation, yet it was intentionally designed to fail at the one thing a vault should guarantee: protection. On the surface, it appeared like any other facility buried beneath California's soil, promising safety, filtered air, recycled water, and life preserved while the world above tore itself apart. Families descended into its steel corridors, clinging to the idea that they had escaped the worst fate imaginable. They believed the door ceiling behind them was a barrier against annihilation. What they did not know was that the door itself had been engineered to leak, to allow radiation to seep slowly into their environment like an invisible tide. Vault 12 was not meant to shield its inhabitants. It was meant to study what happened when survival and exposure became inseparable. When the bombs fell, the ground rumbled, and the great metal entrance sighed shut, and the residents huddled together, waiting for reassurance. Early days were quiet, full of the anxious routines that every vault establishes at the beginning: counting rations, assigning living quarters, scheduling maintenance, forming committees, and choosing an overseer to stabilize the population. Outwardly, life seemed normal enough. The systems hummed. The hydroponics trays glowed with artificial light. Children learned history in classrooms, meant to distract them from the chaos beyond the reinforced walls. Everything looked like a working vault, but deep in the structure's architecture, subtle flaws had been installed intentionally, ensuring that over the months and years to come, radiation would drift inward through improperly sealed mechanisms and deliberately weakened shielding. At first, no one noticed. Radiation rarely announces itself. It doesn't break down doors or scream warnings. It creeps, it lingers, it accumulates. Symptoms began as vague illnesses, unusual fatigue, nausea, headaches, skin irritation. Medical staff tried to treat what they assumed were ordinary ailments brought on by stress, poor sleep, or the psychological strain of confinement. They monitored the filtration systems and examined water samples without realizing that the main threat was coming through the very entrance they trusted. For the longest time, the vault population simply adapted to a low-level unease, unaware that their environment was betraying them. Over time, though, the illnesses intensified. People started experiencing strange degenerative conditions. Wounds healed poorly, hair loss became common. Some residents developed unusual tolerance to radiation levels that should have killed them, while others deteriorated rapidly. Doctors worked tirelessly, trying new treatments, revising protocols, building theories. The overseer held meetings designed to reassure people and discourage panic, insisting that maintenance crews would identify and solve the problem. But the issue wasn't mechanical failure in the traditional sense. It was deliberate design. Every repaired panel, every tightened screw, every replaced part only slowed the inevitable. The vault wasn't breaking, it was performing exactly as intended. Eventually, awareness dawned gradually, painfully, that something was terribly wrong at a fundamental level. Radiation readings, when finally measured accurately, revealed levels far beyond what any secure vault should register. The realization rippled through the population, and with it came fear mixed with betrayal. People questioned their faith in the Vault-Tec promise, the leadership structure, and even the idea that they had ever been chosen for protection. Whispered conversations filled hallways at night. Despair set in alongside anger. If the vault was poisoning them, what choice did they have? The outside world remained far more deadly, yet the haven they depended on was quietly killing them as well. Then the changes began to accelerate. Not simply sickness transformation. Skin toughened and cracked, facial features altered, stretching into something both familiar and hauntingly distorted. Some residents grew strangely resilient. Their bodies adapted to radiation instead of collapsing entirely. They lived longer than they should have, but in forms that terrified them. Others lost their sanity over time, drifting into states of confusion and aggression. The line between disease and mutation blurred. The vault became a surreal mixture of medical facility, hospice, and psychological battleground. Families watched loved ones change into something unrecognizable, yet still undeniably them. The psychological toll might have been the worst part. People grappled with identity as their appearance and biology shifted. Some clung to mirrors as anchors, until one day they couldn't bear to look anymore. Others tried to maintain routines, gardening, repairing machinery, teaching classes, as if daily structure might somehow hold back the tide. But life in Vault 12 slowly transformed into a collective mourning for the bodies and futures they had imagined when they first entered. The hope of emerging into a restored world receded into the past. Survival became endurance, and endurance came with a price they had never agreed to pay. At some point, historians debate exactly when the community crossed a quiet threshold. Instead of fighting mutation as an illness, many residents began to accept it as their new reality. Children born during these years often never knew what unmutated human life was truly like. They knew only stories. For them, Vault 12 was not a place of betrayal. It was simply home, harsh and strange, but familiar. Generations layered trauma into normalization. The vault became both cradle and trap, guiding evolution along an unnatural path created by corporate calculation disguised as protection. Ultimately, circumstances pushed them to leave. Whether through failing systems, social collapse, or the sheer unsustainability of remaining underground forever, the vault's population eventually emerged onto the surface. But they did not return as the descendants of ordinary humans ready to rebuild society. They rose into the world as ghouls irradiated, altered, and immortal in a way no one had expected. Their skin cracked and weathered, their voices changed into rasping echoes, their physiology stabilized into something neither fully human nor entirely monstrous. Radiation no longer threatened them. It sustained them. They were, in a tragic sense, perfectly adapted to the new post-nuclear world. Many outside survivors feared them on sight. Misunderstanding their condition, they viewed ghouls as diseased, contagious, or inherently dangerous. Vault 12's former residents confronted prejudice layered atop the trauma they already carried. Yet despite that, they founded a settlement necropolis. Built above and around the old vault, this city became both sanctuary and memorial. It was a place where ghouls could exist without constant persecution, where they could mourn what had been taken and carve out a life from the remnants. Necropolis was quiet, shadowed, filled with water pumps and broken buildings repurposed into homes. It was a city born from an experiment that had treated its inhabitants as test subjects, but it was also a testament to persistence. Inside Necropolis, leadership formed less around power and more around survival. Ghouls maintained infrastructure as best they could. They guarded precious working pumps. They negotiated with outsiders when possible, sometimes with uneasy tension. Their long lifespans gave them perspective. They remembered the old world, the vault years, and the slow unraveling that had transformed them. That collective memory shaped their culture into something stoic and melancholy. Unlike humans who lived shorter lives and often rushed into conflict, ghouls in Necropolis tended toward patience because time had already stretched for them in ways others could barely imagine. Yet even in this uneasy refuge, vulnerability remained. Technology left behind by Vault Tech still governed the city's lifeline. Water control systems became bargaining chips, points of leverage, and sources of catastrophic risk. Interactions with outsiders sometimes ended in violence or exploitation. Necropolis was never entirely safe. It was merely the closest thing its inhabitants could find to stability, and every cracked wall and leaking pipe served as a reminder that the structure of their existence rested upon decisions made decades earlier by people who saw them not as citizens, but as data. Reflecting on Vault 12 raises painful ethical questions about science applied without empathy. The experiment claimed to study gradual radiation exposure, but the study participants were never asked whether they wanted to be part of it. Their lives, bodies, and futures were commandeered for research wrapped in deception. Vault-Tech's planners likely convinced themselves that the knowledge gained would be invaluable. They might even have argued that understanding radiation tolerance could save countless lives, but in that cold calculation, they stripped agency entirely from those living inside the vault. The residents were sacrificed not by explosion or direct cruelty, but by manipulation disguised as protection. And yet, in a twist that feels uniquely Fallout, the victims of the experiment forged identity from catastrophe. They didn't vanish. They didn't become nameless casualties buried beneath statistics. They adapted, formed communities, expressed emotions, pursued goals, and carried stories forward. Many ghouls from Vault 12 struggled with bitterness toward the company that had warped them, yet some retained compassion, even toward humans who recoiled at the sight of them. Their survival forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths, that transformation does not erase humanity, and that suffering can coexist with resilience in quietly remarkable ways. Walking through the ruins of Necropolis long after its peak, one can almost hear the soft murmur of conversations carried through hollow buildings, voices of people who once trusted a sealed door to protect them. The vault itself, still lurking beneath the city, feels like a relic of betrayal. Terminals recorded data about radiation levels, biological changes, and psychological reports, but they do not capture the private heartbreak of individuals watching themselves and their loved ones become something unfamiliar. They don't record whispered prayers or the silence that follows, realizing that the outside world will never see you the same way again. Perhaps that is why Vault 12's story lingers so deeply in the minds of players and storytellers. It embodies a fear rooted beyond nuclear devastation, the fear of being misled by systems meant to safeguard you. It demonstrates how harm delivered slowly and clinically can be as devastating as sudden violence, and it shows how survivors can become legends in their own right, shaping history in directions the experimenters never intended. In the quiet moments before sleep, thinking about Vault 12 often leads to a kind of reflective sadness. You picture families stepping into the vault at the start, relieved to have escaped the explosion. You imagine them discovering, piece by piece, that the sanctuary they had trusted was the very mechanism transforming them. And then you see them walking years later through Necropolis, immortal yet weary, carrying both the burden and the gift of survival. The experiment succeeded in ways Vault-Tec could measure data on radiation tolerance, charts, extrapolations, but it also created something immeasurable, a population that refused to disappear despite everything. In the end, Vault 12 teaches a paradox the wasteland never forgets. Even experiments designed with cold indifference can inadvertently create new forms of life and culture. Even manipulation cannot fully extinguish agency, and sometimes the people most deeply altered by catastrophe become guardians of memory, reminders that behind every scientific result lies a human story shaped by trust, betrayal, and the stubborn will to continue. Vault 13 was built with patience in mind, the kind of patience that stretches not just across months or even years, but across entire generations. Unlike many vaults with hidden agendas, Vault 13 had one of the simplest directives imaginable: remain sealed, do not emerge, do not meddle, do not attempt to rebuild the outside world until specifically called upon. If other vaults were designed to stress communities with manipulation, Vault 13 was designed to test endurance not in dramatic bursts, but in long, quiet waiting, the kind that slowly reshapes culture from the inside out. Everything about the vault was prepared for that long stillness: extra supplies, strict rationing protocols, redundant systems that might theoretically last a century or longer. Vault 13 wasn't an experiment in suffering, it was an experiment in containment. The residents entered with the same mix of fear and hope that followed every vault ceiling, but unlike populations destined for psychological warfare, they were told something simple and reassuring: this vault is meant to protect you. The outside world will recover eventually, and when it does, humanity will need a few strongholds preserved exactly as they are, untouched by radiation, untouched by lawlessness, untouched even by adaptation itself. Vault 13, they were told, would become one of those preserved capsules. Their job was not to rebuild. Their job was to wait until others had rebuilt enough to need their help. That promise shaped everything in their early years. Where some vault dwellers imagined escape, Vault 13 imagined duty. Inside those walls, traditions blossomed around order. Rules were not viewed as oppressive, they were viewed as sacred. Maintenance cycles were followed with almost ceremonial care. Water rationing protocols were memorized by heart. Children grew up believing that to complain about confinement was not just ungrateful, it was dangerous because every deviation from the plan threatened the survival of the whole. Elders reminded them constantly that they were chosen not for experimentation, but for responsibility. They were the baseline, the version of humanity that would exist unchanged, preserved as reference material for a world that had gone wrong. That pride gave purpose to the monotony. But monotony, no matter how dignified, eventually becomes pressure. Decades passed. People married, raised children, grew old, and died entirely within steel walls. To some, Vault 13 became a sanctuary, predictable, protected, and free from the unpredictable brutality rumored to exist outside. To others, it became a cage. Those who longed for the unknown found themselves at odds with those who clung desperately to the plan. Curiosity wasn't outright forbidden, but it was framed as selfish if it interfered with collective security. The idea that anyone might willingly risk leaving felt like heresy. The vault had been designed to make the world outside feel distant, almost fictional, a story told in recorded archives and historical briefings, not a tangible place people might someday set foot in. Everything changed with something as simple and ordinary as machinery wearing down. The water chip, a critical piece of technology controlling purification and distribution, began to fail. It wasn't dramatic at first. There were fluctuations, minor shortages, maintenance alerts about filtration inconsistencies, nothing the engineers hadn't seen before. But deep inside the system, age had done what the bombs couldn't. Components degraded. The chip finally malfunctioned beyond repair. Suddenly, the vault's most fundamental promise that their environment could sustain them indefinitely cracked. Without clean water, everything else would collapse. And unlike many of their other systems, there was no backup chip stored, no contingency plan designed for this exact failure. Vault 13 had prepared for everything except the assumption that its own technology could betray it. Panic didn't erupt instantly. Instead, dread settled like heavy fog. Meetings stretched long into the evenings. The overseer faced an impossible dilemma. By design, Vault 13 was not meant to open. Leaving carried unknown risk. Exposing the population to radiation or raiders could doom them faster than thirst, yet doing nothing guaranteed eventual collapse. The overseer's eventual decision to send a single person to retrieve a replacement chip was as reluctant as it was historic. For the first time since the sealing, someone would step beyond the vault door, not as a criminal or a rebel, but as a representative. That person became known simply as the Vault Dweller. The choice to send just one individual instead of a larger group reflected Vault 13's deeply ingrained caution. They believed in minimizing risk, in protecting the many by sacrificing the comfort and safety of a single person. The Vault Dweller took on that burden, walking into a world that existed almost entirely in theory up to that point. Their departure marked a psychological rupture. The vault, once entirely inward-facing, now had a living line stretching outward, tethered not just to survival, but to discovery. People whispered about the outside more openly. They wondered what existed beyond radiation charts and archived videos. For the first time, possibility competed with fear. As the Vault Dweller traveled through the wasteland, the reality they encountered was harsher and more complicated than anything Vault 13 had predicted. The world was not uniform devastation, it was a patchwork of emerging cultures, dangerous factions, strange mutations, and fragile settlements trying to define themselves. Along the way, the Vault Dweller changed too. Experience carved them into someone more adaptable, less beholden to the doctrines they had grown up with. They learned that survival sometimes required bending rules, forming alliances, and understanding people whose lives had never known vault walls at all. In a strange way, they carried the vault's honor out into the world, but the world, in return, introduced them to freedoms Vault 13 had intentionally kept invisible. Back inside the vault, time didn't stop. People debated. They argued about whether the overseer had done the right thing. They worried about their envoy's fate, and, beneath that anxiety, something else stirred envy. For some, the Vault Dweller became a symbol of possibility. Someone had walked beyond the sealed barrier and survived. Someone had breathed air that wasn't filtered and looked at a sky that wasn't projected. The stories, when they eventually returned, changed everything, not because of the danger they described, but because of the life they revealed outside. When the water chip crisis was resolved and the Vault Dweller finally returned, they were no longer simply one of Vault 13's own. They were something between outsider and savior, bringing back not just a technological solution but a living testimony that the Vault's isolation was not as inevitable as leaders had claimed. That presence disrupted long-standing emotional balances. People listened with fascination to tales of travelers, towns, and unexpected alliances. They began to question the premise that survival required endless waiting. The Overseer, however, saw danger in that shift. From his perspective, the Vault had survived precisely because it stayed isolated. Opening further might unravel everything their ancestors had preserved. And so, in one of the more morally complicated decisions in Fallout history, he exiled the Vault Dweller, not as punishment for failure, but as containment of influence. The Overseer feared what curiosity embodied in the returning hero might inspire. By forcing the Vault Dweller to leave permanently, he attempted to preserve the psychological shield that had kept Vault 13 obedient for so long. That decision fractured the community in ways no vote or speech could mend. Some felt betrayed on behalf of the exiled hero. Others doubled down on loyalty to the Overseer, convinced that sacrifice for safety was necessary. Quietly, dissent grew not loud enough to overthrow leadership immediately, but strong enough that the sense of unified purpose began to fray. The illusion that the Vault's path was unquestionably correct had shattered. People had seen that there were other ways to live, even if those ways carried risk. Eventually, the schism widened. Residents started leaving on their own, forming breakaway groups that sought to carve lives beyond the Vault's protective shell. Some headed toward communities they had heard about through rumor or the Vault Dwellers' stories. Others simply wandered, drawn more by the idea of choice than by any destination. Vault 13, designed for perfect preservation, began to bleed out its population not through death, but through decision. It was losing the very thing it was meant to protect, its stable, unchanging society. Those who stayed behind aged alongside the Vault itself. Maintenance became harder. Morale weakened. The outside world, once a distant abstraction, now existed in their imagination constantly. And when external forces eventually came in the form of the Enclave and others who saw value in Vault technology and genetic purity, Vault 13 lacked the unity or numbers to defend itself completely. Some residents were taken, others were killed. A community originally built to withstand bombs could not withstand politics, ambition, and human conflict. Looking at Vault 13's story from afar, one might assume it failed. It didn't become a thriving settlement like Vault 8's people did. It didn't transform into something strange, but sustainable like Vault 12's necropolis. Instead, it fractured, weakened, and ultimately succumbed to forces it wasn't designed to resist. But calling it failure misses the deeper truth. Vault 13 proved something essential. Isolation preserves bodies, perhaps, but it cannot preserve hearts or minds indefinitely. Human beings are not specimens. They are explorers by nature. Over time, they will always choose uncertainty over stagnation if hope exists beyond the door. In many ways, Vault 13 became more influential in absence than in stability. The Vault Dweller, exiled yet forever marked by their origin, carried its legacy into the wasteland, shaping events and communities far beyond anything the Overseer could have predicted. Descendants and allies of Vault 13's inhabitants played roles in conflicts and rebuilding efforts across regions. The Vault itself was never meant to produce heroes, yet its greatest impact came from the person it pushed into the world against both their will and the Overseer's intentions. Life inside Vault 13 had been ordered, careful, and deeply moral in its own quiet way, but it was also fragile. Decades of doing everything correctly still couldn't prepare the population for the moral complexity of interacting with a world that had grown without them. They discovered painfully that virtue preserved in isolation is different from virtue tested through interaction. When they finally entered history again, they did so not as untainted models of pre-war humanity, but as a people suddenly forced to reconcile two realities: the safety they had lost and the freedom they had gained. Standing now in the remnants of Vault 13, if you imagine the corridors as they once were orderly, polished, filled with routine, you can almost hear the echoes of a quiet life. Dinner conversations, laughter during community gatherings, lectures about patience and duty. That life wasn't meaningless. It created resilience, education, and discipline. It gave the vault dwellers strength to survive outside, but it also created blind spots, particularly the dangerous assumption that isolation equals safety forever. Vault 13 teaches a different lesson than the more horrific experiments. It is a story about promises kept too well, about a shelter so effective that it almost forgot why survival matters, about a community that held together until holding together stopped being enough, and about how one crisis, the failing water chip, did not break them through violence, but through opportunity. Opportunity led to curiosity. Curiosity led to change. Change led to fracture. It was not radiation or monsters that disrupted Vault 13. It was human growth. Unlike some vaults, its tragedy wasn't betrayal by sadistic overseers or twisted experiments. Its tragedy was time. Its cost was the realization that even the most carefully constructed sanctuary cannot freeze the world's movement or the human desire to participate in it. Eventually, doors must open not because systems fail, but because people need more than survival. They need meaning, connection, and the chance to shape the world they inhabit. Vault 13 waited as it was told. It did its duty, and when the moment came to step beyond duty, its story, like so many in the wasteland, became unpredictable, painful, and profoundly human. Vault 15 was designed on paper to sound like a hopeful test, almost progressive in its intent. Where many vaults were built around cruel manipulations or rigidly controlled social structures, Vault-Tec filled this one with an unusually diverse population, people from different cultures, religions, languages, and backgrounds, gathered intentionally into a single sealed space. The official reasoning, if anyone had ever been told the truth, might have sounded noble. Study how humans cooperate when all their differences are compressed into one shared survival scenario. Could diversity yield strength when the world outside had burned itself apart? Could people build something better, something more inclusive, when stripped of the old world's borders and prejudices? But Vault 15 wasn't simply about coexistence. Its door was also programmed to remain sealed long beyond the point where many vaults reopened. Decades, not years. Generations would live and die without ever seeing the surface. Those extended years of confinement quietly twisted the original premise. Instead of observing how diversity might inspire unity, Vault-Tec effectively trapped dozens of distinct identities in a pressurized space where resources, privacy, and autonomy had limits. What might have flourished under free circumstances was now contained inside steel walls, forced to negotiate constant proximity without meaningful escape. Patience, tolerance, and compromise would be tested not once, but endlessly. In the early years, there was a genuine attempt at harmony. Residents formed councils that tried to balance different traditions, different ways of celebrating, mourning, praying, cooking, and even handling disagreements. They translated for one another. They held cultural gatherings to teach children about heritage, Elders emphasized the idea that diversity was now a shared strength, a sign that even after the Great War, humanity's many stories had survived. The overseer encouraged cross-group cooperation and attempted to keep conflicts from turning into permanent divides. For a time, it worked. Vault 15 became a living collage, noisy, complicated, and strangely hopeful. But unity is fragile when fear, scarcity, and isolation gnaw at the edges. As decades passed, subtle divides reappeared along old cultural lines. People naturally gravitated toward groups that spoke their language, practiced familiar rituals, or shared values reminiscent of their pre-war origins. Those clusters weren't hostile at first, simply comforting. Yet in a sealed environment, comfort easily mistrusts anything different. When arguments broke out over resource allocation, policy decisions, or disciplinary consequences, they increasingly took on the tone of us versus them. The vault's design, cramped hallways, communal spaces, shared sleeping quarters provided no release valve. Every unresolved tension lingered, echoing down corridors and resurfacing in new disputes. Children born in the vault inherited these tensions without context. They didn't remember the outside world that had once framed these differences as cultural rather than existential. To them, identity became factional. You belonged to your family's group. You learned their grievances, their sense of injustice, their whispered history of perceived slights and betrayals. Over time, those whispered histories hardened. Arguments turned ideological. Minor incidents became proof of deep corruption or prejudice on the other side. Where once people had celebrated diversity, they began to weaponize it, each faction convinced that if they didn't dominate governance, they would be oppressed by the others. The overseer position, theoretically neutral, grew increasingly political. Every election mirrored the vault's fractures. Campaigns weren't about maintenance priorities or education reform. They revolved around which cultural bloc would gain leverage. People voted not for competence, but for loyalty to their group. Policies grew inconsistent. Rules became contested. Some factions argued for stricter security and discipline. Others pushed for more freedom, more individual autonomy. A few dreamed about opening the vault early, certain that whatever horrors lurked outside couldn't be worse than the slow psychological erosion occurring within. But the vault would not open. Each time hope rose that the countdown might end, status reports confirmed the same message: remain sealed. The tension eventually escalated into something beyond politics. Quiet resentments turned into physical confrontations. Corridors became contested spaces. Rumors of sabotage circulated, whether true or invented didn't matter. The paranoia was enough. One violent incident led to retaliations. People began to arm themselves with improvised weapons, forming informal militias aligned along factional lines. The original dream of cultural unity shattered, replaced by a fragile stalemate, held together by fear of open conflict spiraling out of control. Then came the moment the vault finally opened, not because the inhabitants had matured into a model of cooperation, but because enough years had passed that the system simply unlocked as programmed. To some, the opening was liberation proof that endurance had finally paid off. To others, it was an opportunity. They walked into the wasteland carrying grudges, ideologies, and ambitions shaped entirely by vault life. Outside, the world was dangerous and unstable, but also wide and tempting. For the first time, factions from Vault 15 didn't have to coexist. They could separate, and they did. One group, yearning for stability and governance reminiscent of the Vault's organized systems, eventually laid the foundations for Shady Sands, a settlement that would grow, evolve, and ultimately become the heart of the new California Republic. They valued structure, agriculture, negotiation, and long-term planning. The lessons they carried were painful but constructive. Diversity can work if supported by laws, communication, and institutions that mediate conflict before it explodes. Their vision looked outward, toward trade and diplomacy, trying to transform trauma into policy. But not everyone shared that perspective. Several exiled or self-selected splinter groups left Vault 15, filled with bitterness and mistrust. They believed strength came from dominance, not compromise. Cooperation, in their eyes, was weakness exploited by rivals. These individuals drifted outward and hardened into raider tribes. Over time, they took on names that would become synonymous with brutality in the wasteland: the Khans, the Jackals, and the Vipers. Each raider culture carried distorted echoes of Vault life loyalty within the group, hostility beyond it, a readiness to take by force what negotiation had once failed to provide. The irony is unmistakable. Vault 15 produced both cooperative nation builders and ruthless raider clans, two paths born from the same sealed chamber. Where Vault-Tec might have hoped to learn something about unity, what they really learned was that diversity under pressure doesn't automatically create harmony. Without structures that nurture understanding and fairness, cultural differences can fracture into tribalism. The experiment didn't just observe conflict, it inadvertently exported it across an entire region. Inside the vault, before the final opening, there must have been moments that hinted at this coming divide. Town hall meetings full of shouting, children forming cliques that refused to mix, elders sitting quietly in frustration, knowing that they were losing the fragile balance they had tried to maintain. Yet there were also probably dinners shared across cultural lines, friendships that defied factional boundaries, and small acts of kindness that never made it into the historical record. Vault 15 wasn't simply a story of failure. It was a story of unresolved complexity, of people who tried, faltered, and adapted in wildly different directions. Once outside, environment shaped those divergent paths further. The group destined for Shady Sands settled near arable land, water access, and trade routes. Stability encouraged cooperation. Councils formed, laws emerged, leaders rose who prioritized infrastructure and education. Slowly, a political identity built around democratic ideals took shape, influenced by lingering memories of Vault elections, but reshaped to avoid the factional traps that had poisoned those elections underground. Their success didn't erase conflict, but it provided frameworks to contain it. The Raider factions, by contrast, gravitated toward harsh territories and survival through violence. The Khans, especially, developed a warrior culture emphasizing pride, loyalty, and endurance. Where Shady Sands built farms, the Khans built camps. Where Shady Sands signed treaties, the Khans forged grudges. Yet even the Raiders were not mindless monsters. They had histories, traditions, and hierarchies, twisted reflections of the organized life they had once known. Their cruelty emerged partly from the lessons they internalized inside Vault 15. When resources feel scarce and trust collapses, domination feels like safety. What makes Vault 15 so quietly tragic is that nobody inside truly intended this outcome. They didn't set out to produce warlords or bureaucrats, raiders or republic founders. They were ordinary people thrown into extraordinary social pressure. Vault-Tec's experiment reduced their complexities into data tracking how long unity could survive, how quickly factions would form, what variables triggered collapse. But outside the spreadsheets, those variables turned into real lives affected for generations. The wasteland still bears the scars of conflicts indirectly born from those sealed corridors. If you imagine walking through Vault 15 long after abandonment, the silence feels deceptive. Walls that once echoed with multilingual arguments now stand empty. Old posters promoting community meetings peel from the metal. Terminals contain logs about disputes, compromises, and hopeful programs to rebuild trust that ultimately fell short. It's easy to think of this place as simply where it went wrong. Yet somewhere in those same corridors, children once played together, trade of skills took place, and people sincerely believed they were building a model of a better world. Vault 15 forces an uncomfortable reflection. Diversity itself is not the experiment. The experiment is what happens when diversity is trapped, unmanaged, and subjected to unrealistic constraints. The vault deprived residents of space to grow, resolve conflicts, and interact with the wider world at a healthy pace. In doing so, it turned cultural richness into a pressure chamber. Some found ways to transform that pressure into cooperation later. Others turned it into rage. Both outcomes were seeds planted by design and scattered into the wasteland when the vault finally opened. Even Shady Sands, for all its promise, carried forward aspects of the vault mindset: cautious governance, bureaucratic processes, suspicion toward chaos. It grew into the NCR, a sprawling republic constantly wrestling with the same balancing act Vault 15 failed to maintain. How do you unite many different peoples without erasing who they are? Meanwhile, the Raider gangs embodied another legacy, an answer born not from careful negotiation, but from the belief that conflict is inevitable and must simply be won by force. In quiet moments, thinking about Vault 15 feels less like analyzing a laboratory experiment and more like watching human nature under a microscope. It reminds us that survival alone does not guarantee harmony, and that good intentions without structures of fairness can unravel into violence just as quickly as bad intentions. Unlike vaults dominated by sadistic overseers or catastrophic malfunctions, Vault 15's downfall was gradual, almost invisible while it was happening. People adapted day by day, not realizing they were drifting further from the unity they once celebrated. And yet, its legacy continues to shape the wasteland in Republic halls, caravan routes, raider encampments, and history books written by survivors trying to understand how their world became so fragmented. Vault 15 didn't just produce stories, it produced entire societies defined by the choices its residents made when locked underground together. Vault 17 is different from many others in this series, not because of the complexity of its experiment, but because of the haunting emptiness left behind where history should have been. While most vaults have clear logs, overseer records, terminal entries, or survivor testimonies, Vault 17 exists mostly in fragments, rumors, references, and scars carried on the bodies and memories of those who escaped. What defines Vault 17 is not the experiment itself, but the fact that its story was stolen, overwritten by another force long after the bombs fell. To understand this vault is to step into a mystery shaped not by technology malfunctioning or communities fracturing, but by something arriving from outside and deciding that the people inside were not subjects, but resources. The vault likely began much like countless others. Families ushered underground amid panic, alarms blaring, the promise of safety echoing through long hallways, the doors sealed, isolating them from the firestorm above. At first, Vault 17 would have followed familiar rhythms, rationing schedules, classes for children, maintenance crews assigned to preserve air filtration and water systems. Some vaults were chaotic from the beginning, plagued by extreme conditions or sadistic leadership. Vault 17 appears, by all reasonable speculation, to have been stable. It did not collapse internally. It did not devolve into political violence or technological catastrophe. Its doom came from outside, long after its residents believed the worst had passed. The Unity, the mutant collective, led by the Master, eventually discovered Vault 17. The Unity viewed itself not as conqueror, but as evolution's next step, seeking to bring humanity into a new form through forced evolutionary virus. To them, vault populations were a rare treasure, concentrated pockets of relatively uncontaminated genetics, preserved precisely because Vault-Tec had sealed them so thoroughly. Where the wasteland held scattered survivors hardened by radiation, exposure, and environmental hazards, vault populations represented something more predictable, something closer to the old world's genetic baseline. That made Vault 17 and others like it irresistible. When the Unity came, they did not negotiate. The vault door, once humanity's last defense against nuclear annihilation, became meaningless against determined outside force. Whether through brute strength, stolen access codes, or sustained pressure, the super mutants breached the entrance. For the residents, the invasion must have been as disorienting as the day the bombs first fell, except this time the threat had a face. Massive figures, towering and violent, surged through corridors that had once felt secure. Panic overtook order. People hid, fought, or fled deeper into wings that offered no true escape. There were no experiments about voting booths or psychological conditioning. There was only abduction. Entire families were dragged from their rooms. Others were separated, adults taken, children sometimes left behind, or the reverse. The vault's identity as a sanctuary disappeared overnight, replaced by the reality that they were livestock in the eyes of their captors. The Unity did not seek to rule them inside the vault or exploit them for labor. Instead, they removed them, one by one, shipping them to facilities where they could be dipped in the virus, evaluated, and either absorbed into the expanding super mutant ranks or discarded when transformation failed. It is here that Vault 17 intersects deeply with individual stories, most famously with Lily Bowen. Lily, later known simply as Lily, was one of those taken. Before the invasion, she had been an ordinary grandmother, a caretaker figure with memories of peaceful vault life. When captured and transformed, she became something physically unrecognizable, massive, powerful, and mentally fractured by the process. Yet she retained splintered pieces of who she once was. Her gentle tendencies, her instinct to protect others, coexisted uneasily with the aggressive conditioning imposed by the Unity. Through Lily's story, we gain glimpses of Vault 17, not through logs, but through trauma filtered across decades. From survivors like her, we understand that Vault 17 wasn't broken before the mutants arrived. The people inside likely followed protocols, resolved conflicts, built routines, and imagined futures where their descendants might one day see the surface on their own terms. Their fall wasn't the result of internal failure, it was the result of being discovered by something far more powerful than they could resist. They weren't test subjects of Vault-Tec's experiment. They became test subjects of the Master's design. The aftermath left almost no records. Vault 17, once filled with life, became an empty shell. Those who weren't taken either escaped into the wasteland or perished during the attack. Over time, nature and scavengers likely stripped the vault of useful technology. What remained was a tomb, not because its systems collapsed, but because its people were erased. Unlike Vault 11 or Vault 15, where moral choices defined history, Vault 17's story is defined by loss of agency. Its residents were denied even the dignity of their narrative, and yet, through that tragedy, something deeply human persisted. Many who were transformed under the Unity eventually broke away, either through rebellion, failed experiments, or the slow deterioration of the Master's influence. Lily herself found communities that accepted her not as a monster, but as someone struggling with identity. Others like her wandered, carrying fragments of Vault 17's memory into the world long after the vault itself faded into obscurity. That lingering memory is important. It reminds us that vault stories don't always end inside the vault. Sometimes they ripple outward through living people whose bodies hold the experiment long after the walls are silent. Speculating on Vault 17's original purpose is inevitably uncertain. Some theorize it may have been a control vault, simply meant to house a stable population. Others wonder whether it held unique research data that made it especially attractive to the Unity. Without accessible logs, these questions remain unanswered. In a sense, that uncertainty is part of the vault's legacy. It is a vault defined by absence of documentation, absence of survivors, absence of clarity. That emptiness itself becomes narrative, a warning about how easily communities can vanish in the wasteland, swallowed by forces that never bother to record their names. Imagining the final hours inside, Vault 17 invites a quiet sadness. People hurried through corridors, trying to protect children, gathering belongings that ultimately wouldn't matter. The overseer, whatever their personality, likely realized within minutes that no plan existed for this scenario. Protocols about rationing or ventilation meant nothing when confronted with supermutants breaking through steel. Doors that once symbolized safety became traps. Families that had weathered years of isolation together were ripped apart in moments. And then, just as quickly as it began, the vault wasn't a community anymore. It was a resource extraction site. In sleep, thinking about Vault 17 brings a different kind of fear than Vault 11 or 12. It's not the fear of moral failure or bodily transformation chosen by corporate scientists. It's the fear of being forgotten of entire groups, disappearing without records, their stories reduced to footnotes in someone else's agenda. For every vault meticulously documented, how many are like Vault 17, swallowed, looted, erased, their legacies preserved only through happenstance? Yet there is resilience hidden in even this bleakness. The supermutants that emerged from Vault 17 were not all the same. Some retained empathy, some questioned orders. Some developed their own identities beyond the Master's doctrine. Their existence complicates the Unity's dream of uniformity. Ironically, by raiding Vault 17 to create a controllable force, the Unity unknowingly spread fragments of Vault culture across the wasteland in forms it never intended. Others lingering memories of peaceful life underground, a few relics, songs, sayings, mannerisms likely survived in unexpected places. Vault 17's experiment, if it ever had one, ultimately became irrelevant compared to the experiment imposed from outside. The true question its story raises isn't about social engineering or psychological stress. It is about vulnerability. Even the most well-designed vault was still part of a larger world. It could be discovered, invaded, and exploited by anyone powerful enough to force the door open. Vault-Tec promised their shelters could wait until it was safe. Vault 17 shows that sometimes safety never arrives. Sometimes the danger simply changes shape. Walking imaginary corridors of Vault 17 now, we don't find dramatic warning messages or elaborate confession logs like in Vault 11. We find silence. We find machines still humming because nobody ever shut them down. We find personal belongings left mid-use, plates on tables, games unfinished, projects abandoned mid-step. The ordinary details of life suddenly frozen. In that stillness, the true weight of Vault 17's fate becomes clear. It wasn't destroyed spectacularly, it was interrupted. For players and storytellers, that interruption invites endless speculation. It leaves room for empathy rather than judgment, curiosity rather than horror. It allows Vault 17 to exist not as a finished story, but as a lingering question about the cost of survival in a world where safety can never be guaranteed, no matter how thick the doors are. Vault 19 was never loud in its cruelty. It wasn't designed around overt violence, or biological tampering, or staged moral dilemmas meant to shock people into impossible choices. Instead, its experiment focused on something far subtler: the slow erosion of trust. The Vault's designers wanted to see what would happen if a community was encouraged, constantly and quietly, to believe that the greatest danger wasn't the world outside, but the person living down the hall. The result was an environment that looked orderly on paper, but felt perpetually tense, as if every conversation hid a second meaning and every silence carried accusation. From the beginning, Vault 19 was divided not physically in a way that prevented movement, but psychologically through careful architecture and policy. Residents were assigned to two sectors, red and blue. The sectors had separate dormitories, separate cafeterias, and separate common spaces. They worked together, technically, maintaining the same vault systems and following the same rules. But they lived parallel lives, encouraged to identify more with their sector than with the vault as a whole. Lines were drawn, quiet lines, invisible ones, and from the very first day, those lines mattered. On the surface, this could have still created cooperation. Different teams, after all, often produce efficiency. But the designers didn't stop at structural division. They added something more insidious: a steady stream of subliminal messaging woven into everyday life. In music played through speakers, in training videos, in recorded announcements layered under white noise, subtle cues reinforced the idea that the other sector could not entirely be trusted, not outright villainized. That would have been too obvious. Instead, messages suggested caution, hinted at sabotage possibilities, and praised vigilance whenever problems emerged. People didn't consciously register these messages. They simply started feeling uneasy. A maintenance error wasn't just a mistake anymore, it might have been tampering. A late delivery from one sector to another became suspicious rather than inconvenient. A rumor, barely grounded in reality, could travel across the vault in hours and be treated as fact by the time it reached the overseer's desk. Nothing dramatic happened at first. The vault functioned. Systems ran. Hydroponics thrived. Children attended lessons where both sectors sat together, only to return home each night to corners of the vault marked quietly by color-coded doors. The beauty and horror of Vault 19's design was that it required almost no direct intervention. The inhabitants, influenced by subtle psychological nudges, did most of the work themselves. Over the years, residents came to interpret the vault's history through sector loyalty. The red sector developed narratives about how often they had to compensate for blue's supposed incompetence. The blue sector collected perceived examples of red's controlling tendencies. Both sides kept informal scorekeepers, the kinds of people who remember every slight, every disagreement, every time they felt dismissed or undermined. And because the vault's physical environment reinforced separation, there were fewer opportunities to break those narratives through genuine understanding. People interacted enough to perform necessary tasks, but not enough to see one another as neighbors first. The overseer, witnessing all this, played a complicated role. They were technically responsible for ensuring safety and unity, but their position intentionally lacked full transparency. The psychological experiment's parameters were tucked behind administrative systems they couldn't entirely override. Records were obscured. Reports were vague. Even if the overseer suspected manipulation, there was little they could do to stop it without risking being viewed as biased toward one sector or the other. Over time, even leadership began feeling the paranoia seep into decision-making. Every policy risked being interpreted as favoritism. Then there were the incidents. Equipment failures appeared near the red sector's areas, and rumors immediately blamed sabotage by blue. A storage crate meant for blue was mysteriously damaged, and whispers pointed back toward red. Evidence was conveniently circumstantial, always just believable enough to fuel suspicion, but never clear enough to resolve. Vault-Tec had designed the ecosystem so that anxiety fed itself. Small coincidences accumulated into patterns in people's minds. Patterns became beliefs. Beliefs hardened into hostility. Psychological symptoms followed. Some residents reported persistent anxiety, insomnia, and intrusive thoughts. Others developed full-blown paranoia, convinced they were being watched by the opposite sector at all times. There were cases where individuals destroyed equipment they believed had been tampered with, only to learn that their sabotage had created the exact failures they feared. To them, this confirmed their belief. Look at the chaos around us. Clearly someone is plotting something. In reality, they were unknowingly contributing to the very instability they dreaded. Children raised in Vault 19 absorbed these dynamics as normal. They grew up speaking in wary tones about them, even if they didn't fully understand who they were. Games imitated real-life, friendly competitions between red and blue slowly took on a darker undercurrent. Points weren't just points, they were validations of superiority. By adolescence, many young Vault dwellers already carried loyalty biases strong enough to overshadow empathy. Once formed, those biases followed them into adulthood, shaping every vote, every partnership, every romantic relationship that dared cross sector boundaries. Yet, even within that pressure cooker environment, there were moments of connection. Some residents attempted to bridge the divide, forming friendships or relationships across sectors despite disapproval. A few proposed shared meals, joint celebrations, or collaborative community projects meant to remind everyone that they still lived in one vault beneath the same roof. These efforts sometimes succeeded briefly, creating spaces where laughter overcame suspicion, but the subliminal messaging never stopped. Slowly, trust eroded again. Conversations were reinterpreted, misunderstandings flared, and those fragile connections collapsed under the relentless whisper that caution was safer than unity. Eventually, the paranoia reached a tipping point. People began suspecting direct sabotage everywhere, and factions started discussing preemptive defensive measures just in case. Some advocated sealing doors between sectors to protect their residents. Others argued for weapon stockpiles. Meetings grew heated, voices rose, and every attempt at mediation was drowned out by a sense that something inevitable and dangerous was looming. The Vault had not descended into full-out violence yet, but the psychological groundwork had already laid itself. It was around this time that opportunities to leave began presenting themselves. Unlike many vaults locked by design, Vault 19 eventually became accessible, whether through system failure, structural compromise, or deliberate decision remains debated. But when that chance appeared, the residents didn't leave together. Instead, they exited in fragmented groups, each convinced that life outside would finally free them from the constant suspicion bred within the vault. They didn't realize they were carrying the paranoia with them. One of those groups eventually aligned themselves with criminals and escapees from NCR correctional systems, becoming part of what would later be known as the Powder Gangers. Their choice of allies reflected a mindset shaped by years of internal division. Trust your own, distrust everyone else, and use preemptive aggression to maintain control. Others, likely drifted into small settlements or isolated camps, their worldview permanently colored by fear. Few, if any, built communities grounded in genuine trust again. Their internal compass had been altered too thoroughly. When the vault itself was later discovered, it felt eerily intact, machinery still humming, corridors quiet, logs sparse and cryptic. What remained wasn't destruction, but absence. The psychological damage had already moved outward into the world, embodied in fragmented groups, shaped by years of engineered mistrust. Walking through Vault 19 after abandonment, one doesn't find dramatic warnings like in Vault 11 or physical mutation records like in Vault 12. Instead, one feels an echo of suspicion, an uneasy stillness, as if conversations had died mid-sentence because everyone realized they could no longer speak freely. What makes Vault 19 troubling to think about before sleep isn't gore or overt horror. It's the realization that division rarely requires force. Sometimes all it takes is a carefully designed environment that nudges people to assume the worst of each other, over and over, until cooperation seems impossible. Vault 19 never needed to encourage violence directly. It only needed to whisper constantly that someone, somewhere nearby, meant you harm. Human nature did the rest. There is, however, another layer of tragedy. Most of the residents of Vault 19 were never malicious. They were anxious, protective, confused, and afraid, feelings that, in healthier circumstances, could have led to mutual support. The experiment exploited those natural instincts, turning caution into paranoia and loyalty into isolation. In calmer environments with open communication and trustworthy leadership, the same people might have built a thriving, cooperative society. Instead, they were transformed psychologically, not visibly, like ghouls or supermutants, but internally, where scars are harder to see and even harder to heal. Reflecting on Vault 19 also raises an uncomfortable question. How many communities across the wasteland, and even before the bombs, fractured for similar reasons, without anyone intentionally pulling the strings? How often do people drift apart not because they are enemies, but because they are convinced they must behave as if they are? Vault 19 makes that invisible process visible. It turns paranoia into architecture, mistrust into policy, anxiety into a permanent soundtrack. In the end, Vault 19 did not explode or collapse. It simply emptied. Its survivors carried its experiment forward unknowingly, shaping conflicts and alliances in the desert beyond. The vault became just another abandoned structure, but the psychological divisions it cultivated lived on, echoing in raider camps, in uneasy settlements, and in the harsh way some people approached relationships after leaving. The real experiment never ended. It simply left its laboratory. Vault 21 was, in many ways, a gambler's dream disguised as a survival shelter. Where other vaults measured psychological resilience or biological endurance, Vault-Tec designed this one around one deceptively simple premise. Every dispute, every decision, every conflict would be resolved by games of chance. Poker, blackjack, dice. Roulette-style systems adapted to everyday governance. The Vault's experiment wasn't about suffering directly, it was about surrender. Could an entire community learn to accept randomness as law, replacing argument and hierarchy with cards and spinning wheels? Could luck become the foundation of justice? When the residents first entered, they were greeted not only by familiar industrial corridors and living quarters, but also by bright signs, cheerful posters, and carefully worded explanations about fairness. The message was clear. In the old world, power concentrated in the hands of the few. In Vault 21, no single person would ever dominate long-term. Decisions would fall to fate, equally available to all. If two people wanted the same apartment, they gambled for it. If factions disagreed about policy, they played a high-stakes tournament instead of debating. The idea sounded liberating, almost utopian in its own strange way. At first, the system genuinely seemed to work. Disputes resolved quickly. Anger dissipated when everyone agreed that the outcome wasn't biased, it was simply luck. Children learned probability alongside math. Teachers explained ethics through card games. The overseer became more of a referee than a ruler, ensuring the rules remained consistent. Residents decorated rooms with playing card motifs, dice sculptures, and whimsical murals celebrating chance as a benevolent force. Vault 21 developed a culture built around tournaments, celebrations, and rituals of risk. It felt like living inside a casino where no one lost money, only pride, territory, or influence. But luck, like any form of power, inevitably creates winners and losers. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain residents excelled at reading people, bluffing, memorizing shuffled sequences, or manipulating wagers to ensure outcomes always tilted in their favor. They weren't cheating outright, merely exploiting the system with intelligence and charisma. Meanwhile, others, consistently unlucky or less skilled, began feeling trapped by a structure that repeatedly left them with poorer housing, weaker political voice, or fewer opportunities. The vault's supposed fairness gradually revealed a new hierarchy, one based not on strength or wealth, but on probability literacy and psychological prowess. The emotional consequences crept in slowly. People who lost major gambles, a family unit's living space, a leadership position, a treasured personal object, sometimes internalized failure as fate, disliking them personally. Instead of questioning the rules, they questioned themselves. Meanwhile, long-term winners developed subtle entitlement, believing that the vault or destiny itself favored them. The experiment subtly rewired how people thought about responsibility. Success felt earned when it might simply have been timing. Failure felt deserved, even when it wasn't. Daily life in Vault 21 turned into an endless balancing act between thrill and anxiety. Minor tasks like scheduling maintenance rotations or assigning educational tracks carried heightened emotional stakes because every decision had to be wagered. Children grew up associating risk with normalcy. They learned to mask disappointment, to celebrate unpredictability, and to accept that fairness didn't always feel fair. Sometimes, the system offered surprising grace, allowing someone with terrible circumstances to win big and transform their living conditions overnight. Other times, it crushed those who had worked steadily, stripping them of hard-earned privileges with a single unlucky hand. The overseer, sworn to uphold the vault's core philosophy, tried to mediate growing tensions by increasing communal celebrations and emphasizing camaraderie. Game nights became holidays, tournaments turned into social events, and losing was reframed as participating in the great experiment. Still, beneath the laughter and spectacle, deeper questions began forming in quiet corners. Was luck really a moral authority? Did chance truly eliminate injustice, or simply mask it beneath spectacle? And then, decades after the bombs, the vault finally opened. Unlike many vault communities, shattered by internal collapse, Vault 21 emerged relatively intact. Eccentric? Yes, but functional and bonded by shared culture. They stepped into the world near what would become New Vegas, carrying with them an entire worldview structured around chance. Where others approached negotiations cautiously, Vault 21 settlers sometimes suggested wagers. Where outsiders saw uncertainty, they saw opportunity. Their habits made them uniquely suited to life near the Strip, where gambling and risk would eventually define the region. Enter Robert House. Mr. House saw Vault 21 not as a curiosity, but as a strategic asset, a population accustomed to following random outcomes without rebellion, and a physical space positioned advantageously beneath the growing strip. He didn't conquer with brute force. Instead, he approached the vault on its own terms. He proposed a wager. If he won, he'd gain ownership over the vault. If he lost, he'd walk away. Confident in their philosophy, the residents agreed, and House won. To the vault dwellers, that outcome wasn't coercion. It was the rules working exactly as designed. They relinquished control because the central belief of their society demanded it. The decision was ritualized. Papers signed, territory ceded. Some residents likely felt proud, maintaining ideological consistency. Others grieved quietly, a grief complicated by the belief that to protest would mean betraying their culture's foundation. House didn't destroy Vault 21 outright, he converted it. Much of the vault became a hotel, hallways polished, rooms renovated, casino-adjacent aesthetics layered over utilitarian structures. Tourists eventually slept where families had once debated friendly wagers about chores. The transformation was surreal. Vault residents, who remained on the surface, could walk the strip and literally see their old home rebranded into entertainment. Others chose to leave entirely, dispersing across the desert with their gambling-based ethics trailing behind them like ghosts of a vanished society. What's quietly tragic about Vault 21 is how willingly it surrendered itself. Not through dictatorship, not through violence, but through unwavering adherence to a rule system that could be exploited by anyone clever enough to play along. The Vault did exactly what Vault-Tec designed it to do: produce people who internalize chance as ultimate authority. The experiment asked not whether humans could survive confinement, but whether they could live under perpetual uncertainty without revolting, and the answer, disturbingly, was yes. Yet Vault 21 wasn't purely dystopian. Its residents built joy into hardship. They celebrated the community. They learned resilience, sportsmanship, humor, and camaraderie in the face of outcomes they couldn't always control. Friendships were forged at tables lined with cards. Families navigated ups and downs together, often with grace. The system did not break them psychologically in the same way Vault 19's paranoia did. Instead, it reshaped their ethics, teaching them that control is sometimes an illusion, and that life, in its own way, is always a gamble. Today, walking through what remains of Vault 21 beneath the strip, one finds a strange tension. Cheerful murals, cartoonish dice, stylized card kings, all layered over the metal bones of a shelter meant to outlast the apocalypse. Guests drinking at lounge tables are unaware that the floor they stand on once hosted serious, life-defining wagers about housing and leadership. That duality makes Vault 21 haunting in its own soft way. The laughter feels real, but it is built over lives governed by relentless uncertainty. And somewhere out there in the wasteland, former Vault 21 dwellers still carry decks of cards in their pockets, not just as tools, but as philosophy. Vault 8 was, in many ways, the promise that the world hoped every vault would keep. It wasn't constructed as a secret behavioral experiment. It wasn't designed to fracture communities or push them into psychological collapse. On paper and in practice, Vault 8 was a control vault, a model intended to demonstrate what life could look like when the vault system simply did what it was meant to do: preserve people, preserve order, and then gently send survivors back into the world to rebuild. Where other vaults twisted into nightmares through hidden directives, Vault 8's mission was almost simple: stay safe, maintain systems, wait for the right time, and when the signal comes, unlock the door, and start again. From the first days underground, that clarity shaped everything inside. The overseer wasn't a tyrant with secret kill switch orders. They were a manager, an organizer, someone expected to coordinate maintenance schedules, mediate disputes, and prepare the community for eventual re-entry. The residents knew from the beginning that their stay would not be permanent. That knowledge altered their psychology in subtle ways. They didn't view the vault as a tomb meant to hold them forever, or as a maze that might never end. Instead, they saw it as a long, structured pause, a shelter through the worst of the storm, followed by purpose. Inside Vault 8, children grew up hearing not myths of the outside, but plans. One day, they were told, there would be open land again, breathable air, and enough stability to rebuild something resembling civilization. They studied engineering, medicine, administration, agriculture, and ethics, not as abstract fields, but as tools they would one day carry with them into sunlight. Where other vaults drifted into paranoia or moral compromise, Vault 8 cultivated patience paired with forward-looking optimism. People took shifts in hydroponic gardens, practiced governance through councils and committees, and made decisions collectively not just for survival, but for the future towns and cities they believed would eventually rely on them. The timetable mattered. Vault 8 had a scheduled opening, not an emergency break triggered by catastrophic failure, but a deliberate, carefully planned release once environmental conditions stabilized. That plan created a rhythm. Residents tracked years the way gardeners track growing seasons. Maintenance logs tied not just to present needs, but to eventual expansion. If something broke, they fixed it not merely to stay alive, but to ensure the system would function well enough when it became the backbone of a new settlement. In that sense, their years underground became a kind of rehearsal. The vault wasn't only a shelter, it was training. When the day finally arrived, it didn't come as a shock. There was fear, yes, and hesitation, because stepping outside meant trading known structure for uncertainty. But it also brought ceremony. The great steel door, symbol of protection and confinement all at once, opened not under duress or invasion, but because the countdown that had been set long before the bombs fell finally reached zero. A wave of desert air, unfamiliar and stark, slid into the corridors. People gathered at the threshold, not as prisoners escaping, but as pioneers ready to take on the responsibility they had been preparing for since the war. The first steps onto the surface were not triumphant in the way hopeful propaganda might have imagined. The world was scarred quiet in some places, violent in others, inhospitable in ways their training manuals could never fully describe. But unlike the scattered survivors already living in the wasteland, Vault 8's people arrived with resources and organization. Most importantly, they had the GECK, the Garden of Eden Creation Kit, a compact but powerful device meant to help jumpstart agriculture, infrastructure, and basic environmental stabilization. In the hands of Vault 8, it became more than technology. It became proof that rebuilding wasn't just a dream whispered through generations underground. It was something tangible. They chose their location carefully, settling near what would become known as Vault City. The landscape was harsh, but manageable, and the vault systems provided enough structure to begin building upward and outward. Using the GECK, they revitalized soil, planned irrigation, and laid out the early frameworks of housing and civic structures. For the first time in decades, members of Vault 8 slept under open sky. It wasn't comfortable, and it wasn't safe, but it felt meaningful. They were no longer caretakers preserving a closed system. They were founders of a new society. As the settlement grew, Its character began to take shape disciplined, orderly, and heavily influenced by the Vault mentality. Vault City, as it came to be called, carried forward the ideals that had defined Vault 8: structure, efficiency, and cautious governance. The people believed deeply in planning, in rules, in systems designed to minimize chaos. They saw themselves not as conquerors or opportunists, but as custodians tasked with rebuilding civilization properly. And because they had lived for generations inside a controlled environment, they valued predictability over improvisation. That mindset shaped every interaction with outsiders. To the inhabitants of Vault City, the wasteland beyond their borders felt dangerous not just physically, but socially. They looked out and saw disorganization raider bands, scattered tribes, improvisational settlements built on barter and shifting loyalties. Having survived by adhering to regulations and long-term strategies, they concluded that success came from structure, not flexibility. As more travelers arrived seeking medical care, trade, or refuge, Vault City responded cautiously. They built walls, they established immigration protocols, they offered aid but under firm conditions. It's here that Vault 8's legacy becomes complex. Their society thrived. It produced clean water, advanced healthcare, and reliable energy. Children born in Vault City grew up healthier than most in the wasteland, but the values that protected them also hardened into something exclusionary. Entry required examinations, background scrutiny, and adherence to strict laws. Outsiders often felt judged rather than welcomed. Where Vault 3's downfall came from openness, Vault 8's challenge came from boundaries. They believed sincerely that they were preserving order, but sometimes that preservation came at the expense of compassion. Yet calling Vault City heartless would oversimplify what it truly was. The residents remembered hunger, fear, and uncertainty from stories passed down about the time before the Vault. They had seen firsthand what chaos did to entire nations. Their rules were born not from cruelty, but from caution, from the anxiety that one wrong move could unravel everything they had built. Every law carried the shadow of the apocalypse. Every restriction whispered, "Never again." And while that mindset created tension with surrounding communities, it also allowed Vault City to stand as one of the few stable bastions of functioning society in a world where stability was rare. Even within Vault City's walls, debate persisted. Some believed they should open their gates wider, share their technology more freely, and take responsibility for neighboring settlements. Others argued that too much generosity would expose them to the very forces that destroyed the old world. Those disagreements didn't tear the city apart the way ideological splits had fractured other Vault remnants. Instead, they were channeled into councils, discussions, and policy shifts. The people of Vault 8 had learned to argue safely, to treat disagreement as a tool rather than a threat. The G, E, C, K, meanwhile, became almost mythic. Residents understood the science behind it, but emotionally, it symbolized divine intervention, a machine capable of transforming desolation into something resembling Eden, even if only on a small scale. It reinforced a quiet belief that Vault 8 had been chosen, prepared specifically for this task of rebuilding. That sense of purpose united them, but it also risked creating a subtle hierarchy. Those from Vault 8 sometimes viewed themselves as more capable, more disciplined, and therefore more deserving of leadership than the scavengers and wanderers who drifted in from beyond the city. The irony, of course, is that Vault 8's greatest strength, its structure, came directly from the absence of experimentation. Their success was not the result of psychological trials or social engineering tricks. It came from trust. Residents trusted their leadership, Leadership trusted the long-term plan, and when the time came, everyone trusted the idea that their role was to contribute to something larger than themselves. That communal trust may be the rarest resource in the wasteland, rarer than purified water, rarer than energy cells, rarer even than the advanced tech hidden in forgotten bunkers. Looking back on Vault 8's history, what stands out isn't a dramatic twist or a catastrophic failure. It's the way ordinary discipline quietly created extraordinary outcomes. While other vaults spiraled into chaos, Vault 8 held together long enough to fulfill its purpose. It didn't avoid hardship, it simply approached hardship with cohesion instead of fear. And when they emerged, they didn't scatter into raider gangs or fractured communities. They built a city. That city was not perfect. It struggled with moral rigidity and sometimes failed those who needed help the most. Yet it also demonstrated that survival doesn't always require cruelty, that planning, cooperation, and adherence to long-term thinking can carve islands of stability in an otherwise lawless landscape. The people of Vault 8 never became legends for dramatic heroics. They became something arguably more important, proof that rebuilding was possible.